Welcome back. You're listening to Patriarch, the retelling of the biblical story of Abraham by me, the author Colin Piper. And you've come to a great podcast. This is one of my favourites. This is one of those wonderful, mysterious passages of Scripture where Abram meets Melchizedek, a king and a priest, and a very, very intriguing guy. Enjoy. Patriarch, Chapter 3, Part 5. Eliezer had tried to leave Eber back in the camp to recover from his exploits, but the old foe would have none of it, and Eliezer grudgingly had to admit to himself that there was more to the man than he realized. But the curious change in Eber was nothing compared with the change he would discover in the one he was now seeking. He soon found Lot's wife and the rest of the household amazingly pretty much intact, but he failed to find the patriarch himself, Lot. Everyone seemed to have forgotten their patriarch, which seemed odd to Eliezer, but not to Eber, who began a thorough search of the most obscure places. Bemused, Eliezer watched as Eber lifted a pile of rugs and with a slight bow of the head muttered, "My lord." The wretch who emerged was unkempt and bedraggled, like the rest of the company they had liberated, but this man was as broken in spirit as he was in body. Good food, fresh water, and clean clothes restored the spirits of most, probably rather too quickly. Nothing, though, could lift this man. He was somehow different. Abram and his friends met up with Lot's household, now neatly ordered by Eliezer and Eber, who Abram noted with some surprise seemed to be working remarkably well together. Together they sat in their tent to take stock of all that had happened and were joined eventually by a washed and cleaned yet listless Lot. When Abram had greeted his nephew with little of the decorum expected of a patriarch, but all the emotion allowed an anxious uncle, he had of course immediately sensed the change. His unpreparedness for it, however, meant he hadn't allowed time and space to follow it up. He hadn't anticipated any other Lot than the one he'd always known, the one who never goes down, so doesn't need to be lifted up, the one who lives on the level, albeit a very superficial one. All Abram had time to do was look into his nephew's eyes, and what he saw, or more correctly didn't see, shocked him. Where previously there had been only emptiness, there now was darkness. What did this mean? Right there and then, though, Abram needed to concentrate on what was being said by the group gathered around him. In doing so, however, Abram became aware of an obvious shift of power. The reaction of those gathered suggested that at best Lot was tolerated. He wasn't sure Lot was aware of the power shift, or whether he cared, or was even relieved by it. It was almost odd. But for now, he was just relieved to have Lot back. He was also relieved to be in male company again. His introduction to Lot's wife hadn't been a good one, and Abram had had cause to wonder whether Kedorlaomer would like some of his treasure back. He'd quickly left her in the capable hands of his dear Sarai, although had felt guilty about doing so and knew from the look Sarai had tried to throw him, but he'd refused to catch, that he would pay for it later. In fact, if he was honest, he now feared that Lot might want to rejoin his household. Lot he could tolerate, particularly the new chastened version, but his wife, she was a different matter entirely. In the event, he wasn't given the luxury of time to reflect upon this or anything else come to that, as the arrival was announced of the king of Sodom. Abram had had his fill of kings, having just returned from chasing 4 of them. He really could have done without meeting any more runaway kings, although he did encourage himself with the thought that at least Bera hadn't brought his 4 friends with him. He could also have done without the tedious formalities of appreciation which Bera was about to inflict upon him. He would have been a little more tolerant if he sensed there was more to this visit than mere formality. It was evident, however, from Bera's nervous and undisguised glances in the direction of the boxes of wealth that all he really wanted was to get his stock back and go home. Abram hadn't even looked in the boxes and would happily have given them straight back there and then if there hadn't been a further interruption and the arrival of yet another king in a place which Abram mused was quite aptly named the Valley of Kings. At the announcement of the arrival of this king, however, Abram's whole demeanour changed. This was a king he was keen to meet. He'd heard a little bit about him, and what he heard intrigued him. It suggested this king was somehow different, and Abram waited expectantly for his audience. He wasn't to be disappointed. As soon as he saw the king of Salem, something in his spirit rose. What he saw impressed him. On the one hand, the king of Sodom stood before him, adorned in the finest and most gaudily coloured sleeveless mantle called a simla. Jewellery hung from him, exotic perfumes defined his personal space and invaded yours, and his positioning, stance and gait was skillfully orchestrated to dominate as best he could. This king, on the other hand, was relatively humbly dressed. The clothes were comfortable and obviously well made, but didn't draw attention either to themselves or their wearer. He wore minimal adornments, and those he did seemed to hold a more secret personal value than obvious material one. His perfumes were understated, as was his sense of presence. You had to seek him out rather than have your attention hijacked. Abram, of course, appreciated this. He understood that here was a man who didn't want to impress the impressionable, but sought communion with those with eyes of their own to see. Abram looked him in the eye, and his heart leapt. There was depth, and as they studied one another, deep called to deep. He would never be able to describe the sensation. This had never happened to him before, and would never happen quite like it again. Here was a man who understood his odyssey and was on a similar one himself. With one look, he'd found an affinity with a human being which surpassed not only that with Mamre, his closest male friend, but dare he say it? Yeah, it was true. Even Sarai herself. It was obviously a mutual appreciation because the king bowed to Abram and laid before him gifts, but these were not gaudy gifts. Abram imagined the king of Sodom would have laid before him if he'd had anything left. Rather intriguingly, his gift was a very ordinary loaf of bread and skin of wine. By now, Abram was more than merely intrigued by the one whose name was King of Righteousness. He was captivated by this king who came unbidden, caused his spirit to soar, humbly bowed before him, and now laid down these most mundane of gifts. He watched closely as the king took the bread in his hands and gently broke it, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, Creator of heaven and earth." it so, all Abram sensed in his spirit was confirmed. This was a fellow worshipper of the one true God, the creator of all things, beside whom nothing and no one else could compare. No king, no God, no thing. Tearfully, Abram reached out and took the bread and ate it in communion with the first fellow believer outside his household he'd ever encountered, and together they ate in worship of the God they knew, believed, and served. Then Melchizedek, the king of Salem, took the cup of wine and in one movement raised it not only to Abram but to heaven. In so doing, he seemed somehow to lift Abram's spirits to heaven too. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hands. Abram couldn't help but smile. There was such lightness in his spirit. All else praised his military brilliance. This man disregarded it and gave credit to where Abram knew it truly belonged. Never was a snub so gratefully received. Here was understanding and more, or much more. The words the man spoke entered his very soul as surely as the wine entered his body. As Abram took the cup and drank, a thought raced through his mind that this was more than a king standing before him. It was a priest. Someone who stood before man on behalf of God, and maybe before God on behalf of man. Still only a man, albeit the fullest man he'd ever met, but a man with a call on his life from God Most High, the same God who'd called him, just a different call. Through the communion enjoyed over the simplest bread and wine, this priestly king had brought Abram to a place where he felt at one with his God. Following this understanding came what could only be described as a tidal wave of gratitude which crashed down upon him and flooded and overwhelmed his senses. Abram fell down before Melchizedek, sobbing, laughing, and gently shaking. Oblivious to all else and all others, he lay there, incapable of responding in any other way. It was only slowly he became aware of himself, and as he did so, he also became aware that he was utterly unaware just how long he'd been in this position. There was such peace and rest there. Not so much before Melchizedek, but before their God. Only the king of Salem knew just how long Abram had laid prostrate before him and what had subsequently passed between the two men of God. Just two more secrets in the mysterious life of Melchizedek. The intimacy was such between the two kings and their God that all others present felt more than awkward. They knew they were observing a sacred moment, but however much they wanted to be a part of it, they couldn't. Instead, they were merely spectators, or worse, voyeurs, and most felt uncomfortable and so quietly left the tents. Lot and Bera lingered longest. Lot stood, seemingly transfixed, and only after some time meekly submitted to being led away by Eber, who alone understood what was going on inside his master's mind and heart, and now was also beginning to understand what might be going on in Abram's mind and heart too. Bera was even less willing to leave. To enter this audience had proved too humiliating for him to leave without the property he'd come to retrieve. Eventually, Eliezer gave him no choice. Once outside, Bera paced up and down, waiting in irritation at all that was going on within. Finally, when the mysterious king emerged, the first thing Bera noticed were the amulets on his arms. He noticed them not only because they stood in stark contrast to the rest of the king's otherwise pitifully bland attire, but also because they were his. What Bera feared most was happening. His goods were being usurped and distributed by this superstitious old shepherd. In a panic, he hurried unbidden back into the tent, for once in his life disinterested in choreographing his entrance to witness servants going through the treasures he'd gathered and hoarded over a lifetime. In truth, Abram had forgotten about Bera until the swirl of robes swept through the tent entrance and the man now stood before him, apparently on the verge of tears. And even then he wasn't really listening to what the wretch was saying. The old trader in him alerted him to the fact that some form of bartering was going on, but he wasn't interested enough in what was on offer to engage. Once more, it was the silence rather than the talk which finally caught Abram's attention. Abram looked around him and saw his servants had stopped the work he'd assigned them. He'd asked them to take 1/10 of all that was there and give it to Melchizedek, a king's share of the prize. He considered it a mere token, but was comfortable with that. Any more, and it might appear that he thought he could truly put value on what Melchizedek had given him in the bread and wine. He couldn't. Any less, and he feared he might trivialize it. 1/10 spoke of his gratitude. Nothing more, nothing less. Of course, he realized he hadn't explained this to Bera, who wouldn't have understood it anyway. The poor man must have thought everyone was helping themselves and he'd be left with nothing. The old trader found it hard to suppress a smile as he realized that his silence during Bera's bartering and pleading must have made the king even more desperate, and Abram's failure to suppress the smile was the last straw for Bera. He knew Abram had been a successful trader, and of course he was bargaining from a position of strength, but Bera couldn't believe he could be so heartless. The negotiations, which had in fact been a monologue, now climaxed with the most extravagant offer yet. For a while Bera considered what to give up and what to keep, although he never would have realized it. This was a defining, even ennobling moment for him. In the next sentence, he showed a surprising understanding of what made a king. Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself. Bera had barely whispered the words, actually, but they were the first words Abram had heard, and they impressed him. In fact, they impressed him so much, he would have been swayed by them if he hadn't already determined what was to happen to all the goods and the peoples he'd unintentionally acquired. Instead, he swore an oath. I've raised my hand to the Lord, Most High, Creator of heaven and earth. He couldn't resist it. His mind went back to the man who stood before him and defined his God in those very terms. He'd blessed him with a new knowledge, understanding, and intimacy over a simple loaf of bread, all of which made what he was about to say even easier than it would have been in any case. And have taken an oath that I will accept nothing belonging to you. What could this man give him in any case which compared to the simple cup of wine which Melchizedek had given and all that went with it? Not even a thread or a thong of a sandal. As Abram said it, he reflected that Bera's thread was probably golden and his thongs were almost certainly embroidered, and therefore the example probably didn't accurately reflect what he was trying to convey to the king, but he continued anyway. So that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. It was God who had done it. God had brought him to this place. God had given him the victory. God had blessed him through Melchizedek. I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who went with me. And Abram turned and looked at his friends who'd gathered at the door to support their first among equals. He looked at each in turn and repeated their names fondly. To Anna, Eshcol, and Mamre. After all, he should at least let them have their share.
You're listening to the Patriarch podcast. For more information, you can go to BibleNovels.com, where you can become a Patreon supporter to support overseas mission.